Hello and welcome to the Jewish Heretics podcast. This is the official podcast of the United Jewish People's Order. We are a progressive Canadian Jewish organization that's been around since the 1920s. My name is David Wall, and I am the community's cultural director, and I will be your host today. For this, the 20th episode of our podcast, I had the honor of speaking to celebrated author and professor Aaron Kreuter. Aaron is the author of 6 books, including the poetry collection Shifting Baseline Syndrome, a 2022 finalist for the Governor General's Literary Award. His work has been shortlisted for 2 Vine Awards for Jewish Literature, a Raymond Suster Award, and a Relit Award. Aaron's much-lauded academic work explores contemporary Jewish fiction, Israel-Palestine, settler colonialism, and diaspora. His most recent book is the novel Lake Burnt Shore, which was included on both CBC Books' 6 sizzling books to add to your summer reading list and the Toronto Star's list of 18 essential summer reads. He lives in Toronto and teaches literature and creative writing at Trent University. Aaron and I had a wide-ranging discussion. We touched on his remarkable literary gifts, including his success balancing humor and gravitas in both his narrative fiction and his wonderful poetry. We touched on the development of his radical politics, his anti-colonial work, and his fascination with the book and film Exodus and how they fit into Zionist cultural history. Here's our conversation. Hello, Aaron Kreuter. Thanks for taking time to be on our podcast. How are you today?
I'm great, David. Thanks for having me on. Excited to be here.
So we like to peer into our guests' origin stories a bit to see how they got to a place of what I'll call radical Jewish expression. Can you tell me about your upbringing, Aaron? What were your parents like? Did you grow up in a religious or a Zionist home?
Definitely not a religious or a Zionist home, though it definitely wasn't like an anti-Zionist home by any means. Israel just wasn't part really of my life growing up. But my parents did they were looking for Jewish community when me and my siblings were younger, and they wanted us to have bar and bat mitzvahs. So we did join when I was quite young. We joined a reform shul, which actually became quite a major sort of social and culturally important part of my life growing up. But my parents were, upper middle class, secular Jewish people. My mom was from the Montreal Jewish community, and my father was from New York City. His parents were communists. They were card-carrying communists. So my dad, I guess, is what you would call a red diaper baby. My second last book, the collection Rebel Children, actually is all set at a fictional reform synagogue, and draws heavily on my own experiences growing up in that milieu, partly sort of exploring the question of this movement that's supposed to be progressive. How does it square its deep-seated Zionism? From there, my political awakening was very much tied into the Iraq War. When I was 16, we started going to the anti-Iraq War protests in downtown Toronto, and that really sort of was the beginning of my political awakening, which didn't necessarily turn to Palestine for a few years later, but it's all sort of very much the same organic journey.
And can you talk about that shift in or your the interest in Palestine that happened? When did that happen, and why?
Like I said, I was never like a card-carrying Zionist, to put it that way. I knew Israel existed, and I probably believed in its right to exist, but I didn't really know much. And then my geopolitical, awareness started to grow, especially with the Iraq War and American imperialism and settler colonialism more generally. My partner and I, we did go on Birthright. And I was very much put off by the entire experience. I remember so clearly, the soldiers who come visit you and stay with you or whatever. And then our like tour bus leader was like, see, now that you see that these soldiers are just regular people, now you know that like the Israeli army can do no wrong. Like that was literally the line of argument. I also wrote about my experience on Birthright in a short story in my first collection. The collection's called You and Me Belonging, and the story's called Amsterdam, and it's basically about the story's about three young Jewish men who extended the Birthright trip, and then we're in Amsterdam just like getting high and being totally debaucherous. And sort of the main character in the story basically starts hallucinating what it would have been like if Anne Frank went on a Birthright trip. Yeah, and then Steph and I went back to Israel in our early 20s and spent some time in Tel Aviv and on a kibbutz. And it was probably right around there that my anti-Zionism really began to take shape. Unless your vision is totally occluded by the Zionist worldview, it's impossible to be in Israel-Palestine and not see what's going on. It's apparent in every single street corner or interaction or news story you see while you're there.
I mean, what I find interesting though, because you and I have similar upbringing in certain ways, because I mean, I do find it interesting that my parents never talked about Israel when I was a kid. It wasn't that they, my mother ended up being staunchly anti-Zionist, but my parents, it was just erased. So I never had an inkling of a notion of an idea to go on Birthright. I like that there was talk with my best friend in high school of maybe going to Israel, but it never happened. But the whole Birthright concept, it's interesting that there was a desire to go there at all. And I'm curious as why that happened. Why did you go on Birthright? What was the impetus for that? And then live on a kibbutz.
Yeah, it's exactly like you said, David. Like Israel wasn't part of our household at all. Just wasn't something my parents cared about. Though when we did join the Reform Shul, my parents' group of friends were all very much Zionist, and so that became something that became a part of our lives. I don't know. I guess my growing interest in the history of Zionism and the settler colonial project of Israel, I probably wouldn't have called it that in my late teenage years. That's just sort of the avenue the exploration took. Like Birthright was like, we had tons and tons of friends who did it. And then, it being a free trip and you being able to extend the trip, not that we did, is a massive draw. I mean, Birthright is an incredibly successful project of indoctrination, right? That deserves study and deep critique. Yeah, I was, I'm not going to deny that I was young and naive. I definitely want to go on Birthright now, and I would tell people not to go for sure. But I did go, and I can't deny that.
No, I'm not criticizing you. I'm saying I just don't remember it being offered to me or me being interested in it at all. It's just, and especially because you had a kind of that Israel wasn't even in a reality when you were a kid. It's just interesting. So many people did it, and I it just was not in my consciousness of that. So maybe that's leading nowhere. It doesn't matter.
For sure. I could talk a bit more about that. I did go. I went to a number of different summer camps. This is like a nice segue into the novel, which is about summer camp. But the summer camp I spent the most time at as a camper was in the Young Judea system, which has a bunch of camps across Canada, Zionist camps that all feed into Billoween, where you all go when you're 16. So I was at Kinneret, which was in Quebec for 3 years, and then Billoween, and those are Zionist camps, and there's soldiers and stuff. But it's not like there was like study sessions where like we learned about like the the beautiful state of Israel or anything like that, but it was definitely in the air. And then after Billoween, after your 16th summer, you normally go on like Billoween Israel, where you go and you spend 8 weeks in Israel. And I guess I was fully prepared to go on that trip, but it was actually, that year was canceled. That would have been 2002. That year was canceled because of the Second Intifada. So,
right.
this idea of going, this option, this idea of going to Israel was in my mind, I suppose.
Mm,
That
mm.
being said, yeah, I've been obsessed, probably dangerously, with like Jewish history and culture and progressive
Yeah,
politics,
yeah.
and literature for like my entire waking life. And I think sooner or later, you're in those earlier years of exploration, you're going to bump up against Israel and Zionism. And I guess I wanted to go and see it for myself.
You
Yeah.
want to see it for yourself. I think that's an amazing way to look at it. Because a lot of, including myself, I spent a lot of time, of course, criticizing Israel and criticizing the Zionist project. But I did go there a couple times when I was a kid, but I didn't have a fully cognizant experience of the place. And I regret that, and I suppose it's not too late. Before we get into Lake Burnshore, which is this incredible novel that has been on lists of great summer reads, et cetera, et cetera, I'd like to talk about your work more in general. I think that you're really good at balance. You do an incredible balancing act in your work. So, for example, in your poetry and prose, and you do mix that. You write prose poetry. You have this wonderful flirtation with humor. And a perfect example of this, I'm just going to reference a title of one of your poems, which I think perfectly encapsulates what I'm talking about. Here's the title of a poem from your collection, Shifting Baseline Syndrome. 18 Ways of Looking at Magneto Destroying Auschwitz in X-Men Apocalypse. That's the title. And to me, so that has, you mentioned it's got the Shoah in it. It's got, traumatic history. It's got pop culture, an X-Men movie, and it's funny. So you're able to blend humor with traumatic history in this incredible. Can you first of all, talk about humor as a mechanism for examining dark subjects? Because it's something you do so well.
Thanks for referencing that title, David. I believe that'll be the first time that poem has been mentioned on a podcast on the air, and I couldn't be more thrilled, of course. Yes, of course, humor is a really, really central part of my writing project, especially in the prose, in my poetry. The poems in Shifting Baseline Syndrome, more or less use humor, to destabilize, to defamiliarize, to bring energy into the poem, to have the reader, sort of engage with it, and just to be funny on its own, right? I think, humor and laughing and comedy are great tools on their own. And then sort of my poems usually, especially my prose poems, usually have like a bit of a switch, a bit of a volta, to use the poetic term, where like the humor sort of becomes more serious and there's much more of a dark undertone. But yeah, my poems are usually satirical, like I send up power and capitalism, etc. Shifting Baseline Syndrome, a lot of it has to do with television and these mainstream narratives and how they play out on our bodies and our lives. And so that poem is an excellent example. I'll never forget the first time I watched that X-Men movie, X-Men Apocalypse. And when, I don't know if you've seen it, David, but when Magneto destroys Auschwitz, it's like this unbelievably over-the-top scene. And, I knew right away that I was going to write a poem about it. And then it went from there. Well, to talk about my fiction, my short stories and my one extant novel, like Burnshore, I do use humor as well, for sure, but I think I use it in a bit of a different way in the fiction, though maybe that's not so true. But I love when things are funny and humorous, and as I was saying, making fun of something, especially when you're making fun of something that has power, something that's above you on the hierarchy, is a great way to destabilize and satirize and defamiliarize.
I know this is sort of trite and gets asked of authors all the time, artists all the time. Can you talk about some writers that you really appreciate who have done this kind of thing? I mean, I'm thinking in the most idiotic, perhaps, example is The Producers by Mel Brooks. But are there writers that you appreciate? Is there a kind of tradition, a literary tradition that uses humor in a way that you appreciate?
Yeah, of course. I mean, Mel Brooks, comedy is a major part of Jewish narrative expression, right? And I definitely see myself as plugging into that. Mordecai Richler is definitely an author who's had a major influence on my writing, and he just uses satire so mercilessly.
Yes.
There's really no topic that's like taboo or off limits for Richler, and so I definitely uh, uh, appreciate and see what Richler's doing there. Even like a major 20th century American Jewish author like Philip Roth, like he the way he uses humor as well. So all of which to say there's major antecedents for my use of humor, especially in satirizing taboo subjects in the Jewish world, for sure.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to like Sholem Aleichem and the wise men of Chelm and satirizing humor is a big part of Jewish literature and art. Um, I'm thinking of two different paradigms, and I'm wondering if you could respond to this. So, is humor in Jewish traumatized literature? Is it a coping mechanism? I mean, sometimes that cliche is utilized. Oh, you laughing through tears, that kind of thing. Or is it, maybe in your case, is it more like putting chocolate on an onion? In other words, the humor is there to kind of draw people in, and then there's this undercore of trauma. Do you know what I'm saying? Where do you think you fit in terms of your use of humor?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you rightly sort of marked both ends of the spectrum of like Jewish humor, perhaps. I definitely would be more on the on the chocolate over the onion realm. Uh,
Maybe I should take up
as
take up poetry.
yeah, no, it's a great metaphor. Onion being such an Ashkenazi food too
Well,
in a way, of
I
course.
will interject and say that it doesn't really work because apparently I had a great aunt who used to eat onions like apples. She would just chew them.
Yes, for sure.
But anyway, do go on. Sorry.
Um,
So
yeah,
where?
I didn't have a traumatic upbringing, right? I'm not like, but Jewish history has its sad, violent moments, but also, these unbelievable moments and periods of, diasporic joy and livelihood and unbelievable, literary production, to keep talking about literature. But yeah, I mean, I plug in. I think I do plug into that tradition of using humor to deal with horrible things, but it also, more so in my work, it ends up being a way of sort of, you know, sneaking in serious subject matter.
Hmm. Hmm.
Also, in terms of a novel, in terms of a narrative, a character who tells a lot of jokes or something, that character becomes very vivid very quickly. Having there be like, humorous interactions between characters or a whole scene of humor, that's just a way to build literary energy, right, to bring people in.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's all very much part, and it's not just one thing in my work. I use it as everything, foreground and background,
All right, right,
etc.
right. Um, let's talk about Lake Burnt Shore, which is this wonderful novel. It's gotten a lot of praise, and there is, I talk about this a lot in art that I appreciate and artists I appreciate. Like pleasure is such an important aspect of art for me, that even the experimental work for me, I really resonate with pleasure, and Lake Burnt Shore delivers that very successfully. It's pleasurable. It's an enjoyable read. And I really do. I'm just going to keep you with praise a little bit. You do manage this incredible balancing act, and it's not just about the humor. You use humor and romance and things like that, what I call lighter touches, to wrestle with politics and ethics around colonialism, both in Israel Palestine and in Canada Turtle Island. but it doesn't become a polemic. So that's the balance I'm talking about. It's not you're not just being didactic; it's pleasurable and beautifully written. So there's my praise. Now I'm going to ask you a question that you actually touched on earlier, briefly, when you were talking about your own political awakening. A thing that I find remarkable in the book, and just I was flabbergasted, is the plot line around IDF soldiers being brought into a kid's summer camp. Like, I guess that happens. I had a really terrible experience in one summer camp when I was a little kid, a Jewish camp called Northlands, and I've repressed it because it was so awful. But I don't remember IDF members. Maybe they were there. Does this happen? Did it happen to you? Is this autobiographical? Can you talk about that? Like, I just find it amazing.
For sure, yes. Thanks for the praise, David. It really means a lot to me, for sure. Yeah. As we were talking about with the humor part, I definitely want the novels can work on so many levels, and I really wanted the novel on one level to be, as you put it, an enjoyable read about sex, drugs, rock and roll over this one summer in this beautiful geography of forests and lakes and cabins and etc. And lots, there's lots of music in the novel too. But then, on another level, not even necessarily a deeper level, to be about these big, political, ethical, moral, human concerns, and mishing them all up together, because life is mished up like that too, right? So to try and capture that mishness, to coin a phrase maybe, in the novel was really important to me. So the novel Lake Burnshore takes place at this fictional Jewish summer camp in Muskoka called Camp Burnshore, which is on the aforementioned lake. And until the summer of the novel, 2013, Camp Burnshore was a very secular camp that had nothing at all to do with Zionism and Israel-Palestine. But at the beginning of the novel, more than normal amount of staff get kicked out for smoking pot, and so there's this major staff shortfall. And the camp owner's son, whose name is Brett, he's a big Zionist. He convinces his father to bring in 5 Israeli soldiers to act as emergency staff. And that sort of is the first crisis in the novel, where the protagonist, 21-year-old Ruby Schachter, who is a university student and a committed anti-Zionist and very involved in anti-Zionist politics at York University, or the school she goes to, is incensed that these soldiers are coming to the camp, and she's deeply worried that they're going to forever change the texture, the atmosphere of her beloved summer camp, where she thinks of herself as going to escape the political battles of the summer. And this is a very, very real and deeply, deeply troubling phenomenon. Israeli soldiers or Israelis who very recently finished their army service coming as staff to Jewish summer camps. A month or two ago, I actually published an article in Mondoweiss about Israeli soldiers at summer camp. I was really interested to see how this phenomenon had changed or shifted since October 7th and the ongoing Israeli genocide in Palestine. And I was absolutely shocked by what I found, even though I had done plenty of research on this for the novel. In the summer of 2024, there were 1,500 Israeli soldiers or ex-soldiers at 158 Zionist summer camps across North America. That's the U.S. and Canada. So I mean, and this is official policy. There's like a government agency in Israel that deals with this, placing Israeli soldiers as staff, and they very much are there as representatives of Israel and Zionism and the Zionist narrative. So when we talk about the importance of narratives in shaping our worldviews, that's something Lake Burnshore is also deeply about, right? How did the Jewish collective become so ensconced in Zionism that for many of us it's basically impossible to see through or around it? The way the campers interact with the Israeli soldiers, they're obsessed with them, they're so hot, etc., etc. You really see how these ideological connection, how this ideology can become implemented and implanted. Yeah, for that article I wrote for Mondoweiss, I basically just Google searched it and I found a treasure trove of articles of Jewish summer camp directors and people who work at like the Center for Jewish Camping. That's not what it's called, but whatever. And Israelis basically bragging about Israeli soldiers' place at summer camp. One camp director said, for a soldier who just came back from Gaza, spending 5 days at our camp is like having 3 years of therapy. And so, right away, that's insane.
Yeah.
Why are these Jewish summer camps expending time and resources giving free therapy to this soldier who very well may be a war criminal? Yeah. Anyways, it's a whole huge thing, right? Where there's conferences in Israel where camp directors go and like discuss like what ways to implement the Israeli soldiers and their experiences into camp life. It's a major phenomenon. And so, but by having the novel set up in this way, where Camp Burnshore is like a very secular, non-affiliated camp, and there's many of those. It should be said, I guess, that Jewish summer camps very, very much exist on a wide variety of spectrums and axes, right? Very secular to very religious, apolitical to Zionist, progressive to right wing, geared more towards wealthier Jewish families, and then more community center oriented. And so I wanted to sort of explore that distinction in the novel by having these soldiers come to camp. It very much shows the difference between these two different ways of sort of doing Jewish summer camp. You mentioned Northland. I also went to Northland for a couple years as a child before I switched to Kinneret Biluim, as I mentioned. But Northland did not have soldiers at it at all, and now they definitely do. So Northland sort of went through the change that my novel is about. I do want to mention, and I mentioned this at the end of my article on Mondoweiss, that there is some, though probably small right now, but there is some small pushback against the place of Zionism and Israeli soldiers at summer camp. Some parents have written letters to the director saying we should probably rethink our approach to this example. One camp in Canada actually stopped raising the Israeli flagpole every morning, which the fact that they did that at all is absolutely bananas.
No, it's
as sites of ideological capture, this is like, it's good, but it's definitely too little, too late, right?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I just find
Zionism's going to take down the entire Jewish world with it, and we have to try and, one thing I wanted to do with Lake Burnshore is, challenge this dominant narrative of Zionism and the importance of Israel, and try and replace it with something.
Well, that leads me to the next step. Let me just reiterate: I am utterly amazed and flabbergasted by the presence of Israeli soldiers in Canadian summer camps. It's just beyond belief to me, obviously, but it's the kind of thing that just seems to go under the radar and has been normalized. And I'm glad there's pushback, but I do find it amazing. I want to segue now to something, and you've just kind of enabled me to do that. You talk about alternatives to kind of Zionist imagination, Zionist imaginaries in Jewish culture. So our organization, the United Jewish People's Order, recently ran an online event with you that was called Challenging Narratives, Jewish Literature and Zionism, in which you talked about Jewish supremacist tropes in 20th century Jewish literary and cultural history. Can you talk about some of these themes here again? I especially, for example, loved your analysis of the book and film Exodus, and how you place that in this history. So, here's your. I'm encouraging you to revisit your talk, basically.
Thanks, David. Yeah, and this leads a bit more into my academic work, which, as we'll soon see, is very, very related, right? my dissertation, the work I did during my PhD, which has now been published as an academic book, a monograph, is all about Jewish, mostly North American fictions role in setting up Israel and Zionism as central to Jewish identity, right? My academic book basically asks the question: if novels like Leon Uris's Exodus, which for those of us who don't know came out in 1955 and is like a 800-page genre sort of cowboys and Indian telling of the foundation of the Israeli state by these sort of like heroic cowboy-esque, can do no wrong Zionist figures, unbelievably hagiographic, unbelievably racist novel that sold in the millions and millions of copies. The question is, if a novel like Exodus can have such a major role in cementing Zionism as the dominant narrative in the Jewish world, is it possible for Jewish fiction to have a role in critiquing this dominant narrative, tearing it down, and even replacing it? And my answer is basically yes, though. Though Jewish fiction hasn't gone as far in doing that as, I would personally like. I definitely see my own fiction writing, like Burnshore, my earlier collections, in doing this, what I see as very important work. I truly and viscerally believe that fiction, that literary narratives can have a major impact on the real world, right? And as we see that with Exodus, right? Even though I think a lot of sort of liberal Zionists would shrug off Exodus by saying, "Oh, that's so outdated. It's very old way of looking at Zionism," and it's just not true. The arguments and the justifications and the workarounds that Uris embedded into Exodus are very much the ones we still see in circulation today. There's like a 50-page part of Exodus at the end of the book when right after the UN partition vote, when the UN and the world are focused on the Palestinian refugees. Like, everyone knew what happened in 48. They knew there were 700,000 Palestinian refugees who were just ethnically cleansed from Israel, and the UN and the world basically wanted these refugees to return back home, return back to their homes in Palestine. And one of the main characters in the novel writes a 20-page report basically saying why these Palestinians should not return to their homes. And we get the entire report, and it's the exact same lines and ideas we hear today from Zionists about, why Palestinians had no right to return to their land. In case the listeners, aren't aware or don't remember, 700,000 or so Palestinians were ethnically cleansed in the Nakba in 48. 400 villages totally destroyed, and the Palestinians that were pushed into what became the Gaza Strip. Literally, the second they arrived there, they became stateless and homeless. And literally, as soon as they attempted to cross out of Gaza and go back to their home in like the late 40s and early 50s, they were labeled terrorists, just from them trying to walk back to their homes that they were at mere weeks ago. And that has literally not stopped since then. Anyways, all of which to say, Exodus is majorly important in this sense. And the fact that it's a novel is not lost on me, right? It's a fictional narrative that's very much based on history, of course, but the major characters are all fictional. And so I'm actually working on a bit of a essay/manifesto on this right now, which is tentatively called like Jewish Fiction After October 7th. Basically, basically making the call for more Jewish fiction that interrogates Zionism and Israel from an anti-Zionist or diaspora ethics viewpoint.
No, that's amazing. In your talk that you did with us, you talked about there were some examples of Canadian fiction, I think, that you use as sort of contrastively. There were a couple of books. Do you remember what I'm talking about? There were one or two that were sort of lauded that did really well in the Canadian literary landscape that you said was just rife with kind of overwrought and frankly ridiculous Zionist tropes. So
Yes.
this is still going on.
Oh, I remember. I believe the novel you're referring to now is Nora Gold's novel Fields of Exile, which won the Canadian Jewish Literary Award, which is a very conservative literary award. And that novel was about Israel-Palestine politics on campus. In some ways, very, very topical, of course, but all the same Zionist tropes and talking points we see today are in that novel. I actually think it's important to talk or write or look at this novel. That's an example of Jewish fiction just upholding the Zionist narrative. I also briefly mentioned another Canadian Jewish novel, which I think does the opposite kind of work, which is Alison Pick's Strangers with the Same Dream. Have you read this novel, David?
No, I haven't.
I think it's fantastic. It's set at a early kibbutz in like the 20s in the Mandate period, and it's about these very, very young European Jewish Zionists, and they would consider themselves like diehard socialists, though of course the socialism they wanted was for Jews only, right? And it's about them setting up the kibbutz and their naivete, their relationships with the Palestinian Arab families who live next door to the kibbutz, their obsession with the kibbutz has this one gun and they're absolutely obsessed with it. And what ends up happening in the novel, I don't want to spoil it too much, just eviscerates the narrative of the early Zionist pioneers, like building these settlements. So I think that's a strong example of a novel that takes the Zionist narrative and just obliterates it. Yeah, but those novels, as far as I'm aware, are few and far between. Mostly in like the second half of the 20th century until very recently. This is beginning to change. Israel-Palestine was basically ignored in Jewish North American fiction, which is important on its own, obviously. And often when it was there, it was just Israel was just a background. It wasn't actually doing the like literary work of exploring or questioning or pushing against these narratives. There's beginning to be a shift for sure in the past little while, but I definitely want to see more of that work being done in the near future.
It's interesting. You're talking about your next project being around alternative ways of expressing Jewishness through anti-Zionism or critiques of Zionism in literature, and you're talking a fair bit about what you see as a need for a shift, and you're glad to see that there's a shift in kind of Jewish literary trends towards a critique of Zionism. Can you just this speaks to me of really a central problem is the wrong word, but complexity. Why is it important to you? What do you see as being so essential in changing Jewish literature? Why is that important? How does that reflect on politics, society in general, and what? So I sort of instinctively understand why that's important. But can you talk about that? Why that's such an important project from your point of view?
For sure. I'll start to answer that question by backing up just a tiny bit and by saying, the actual novels themselves is a very, very important locus for this struggle, right? Of course, but a bigger or a different part of the story and a bigger impediment isn't the books themselves, but it's the world around the books, right? It's the institutions around Jewish literature, right? It's the publishers, it's Jewish awards committees, it's Jewish literary reviews. It's the institutions that really need to change to allow this type of literature in. Yeah, as I said earlier, I truly believe that literature, fiction in particular, plays a vital role in shaping the world we live in preventing instilling worldviews, senses of self, senses of community, etc. So in that alone, we can see why Jewish fiction. Why I think we need to do better with the stories we're telling ourselves. Right? I don't. And I'm not sitting here saying like this is what a Jewish writer has to write about, but I do believe that if a Jewish writer is sitting down to write a novel that they want to be about, the contemporary Jewish world, you can't just bracket off Israel Palestine. It's like it's impossible. And so that is definitely what I'm saying. Also, to my mind, really digging in and exploring how this happened in the Jewish world, how Zionism got such a stranglehold on it, is really, really important, psychologically complex work that if there's any chance of our community writ large of moving beyond Zionism and beginning probably the endless work of endless reparations to the Palestinian people, I think literature and the stories we tell about ourselves is going to be a major side of that, and also exploring Zionism and its role in the Jewish world can definitely, to my mind, on a more universal scale, help us as a species from preventing this from happening again. The unbelievable, tragic, horrendous, violent irony of the Jewish people, and this post-Holocaust slogan of "never again," and then the same people putting all of their chips in a violent ethnic nationalist state that can only exist by oppressing millions and dehumanizing millions of Palestinians. That is worthy of deep literary investigation.
Mm-hmm.
I think that begins to gesture towards answering your question.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Obviously, I'm being kind of rhetorical here, but one might argue, well, who cares about literature? We should be out in the streets ending the genocide. That's what I'm getting at. It's like what is the importance of a literary project? That's what I was getting at, and I kind of know the answer, but it is, in other words, why is it important to have a new Jewish kind of literary voice? But I think you kind of...
Yes, for sure. I can definitely speak to that. And my thoughts and my strongly worded statements about Jewish literature right now is by no means taking away from the struggle on the streets and in the streets and in Palestine itself. And I also by no means intend or think that this should overshadow Palestinian suffering and the Palestinian narrative. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that at all. I very much think the struggle against Zionism, which, is only one part against the struggle against the system as it is, right? Capitalism, ecological destruction, the weapons factories, the billionaires. It's all really part and parcel of the same thing. But these battles are going to be won on multiple fronts, right? Yeah. And we all have roles to play, and I do believe really strongly that literature is one place where this battle is fought. There was an article in Jewish Currents a couple weeks ago about the need for new Jewish institutions.
Yes.
By Ariel Angel. It's an excellent article, and I feel very similarly about the need for new Jewish literatures, and I think sometimes there might be merit in the idea that talking about what the Jewish people should do. Maybe it can spill into like taking space away from the Palestinians, who we should all be sort of following their lead. But as Ariel points out in that article, like if we don't create new Jewish institutions, if we don't create new Jewish literature, we're just ceding the ground to the Zionist core, and to me that's very much that's counterproductive as well. I also, of course, corollaries, I think Palestinian literature is extremely important and extremely, extremely vital. I just finished the novel Minor Detail, which is excellent harrowing, very, very powerful fiction. Yeah, for
Mm.
sure.
Hmm. One of the themes of your of Lake Burnshore is this stuff around First Nations rights and Turtle Island, and because there's a theme in which I guess the owner of the camp wants to buy up Crown land, and there is a kind of parallel between First Nations experience in Canada and Palestinian experience. What? How do we? And also, I'll also mention that your poetry and you have dealt with ecological themes extensively, and you have a really deep connection to nature and a kind of mourning of the ecological loss. How do you digest and how are you active in all of these fronts at the same time? A critique is levied often at anti-Zionists and people who are up in arms about Palestinian rights that, well, what about you live in Canada? What about the First Nations, the colonial project in Canada? Why aren't you putting your energy into that instead? How do you balance these things?
I would just first off, that line you hear from Zionists, why aren't you caring about this? Why aren't you caring about this? Is obviously just a rhetorical device, right? They don't care either. They're just using it to shut down any conversation at all. And I care. To talk about the genocide happening in Sudan, I care very, very deeply about that. But a major difference is that I don't have members of my extended family and friend group and community writ large, going on loudly about how the genocide in Sudan is necessary and that they deserve it. So, that is one reason why I put a lot of my energy against the
Yes.
Zionist narrative, because I'm in it. I live in it.
Yes.
So that's one answer to that question, even though I don't really think that question even deserves an answer. But in terms of ecological aspect of my work, I do think that no matter what the main subject or themes are in a poem or a short story or a novel of mine, the ecological is always going to be there because take Lake Burnshore for example. One way to look at the novel is that it explores different ways groups of people can live on the land, right? Whether that's diasporic, settler colonial, indigenous. I sort of put them all together in this bounded space of a Jewish summer camp and sort of see how it plays out. So yeah, we talked about how sort of the first major crisis in the novel is the arrival of the Israeli soldiers, right? But the second major crisis is when Brett, the camp owner's son, Ruby finds out that he's also planning on buying 10,000 acres of crown land that abut the camp and are around the lake. Crown land, of course, being so-called land that is owned by the Canadian government / British government. That's why it's called crown land. It's sort of very similar to federal land in the States. And that land by right belongs to the Black Spruce First Nation. So now Ruby is sort of fighting the camp on this multi-pronged battle one against the ideological capture of the camp by Zionism and against this wanton expansion into indigenous territory.
Yeah. So the question is, yeah. Sorry. Go on. Sorry.
And thanks. Brett very much frames his desire to buy land as this Jewish Zionist settler colonial desire, right? He says, if Jewish people in Europe had a land base like this, then the Holocaust would never have happened. He very much couches it in those terms, and so and that's one reason the novel set in 2013, which was the major summer of I Don't Know More, the Indigenous and First Nations uprising against the Canadian state, and the major Anishinaabe characters in the novel, Cindy and Jeff, become involved in protesting basically against the camp's plan to buy all that land. So the camp and this summer ends up bringing to the surface these connections between settler colonialism here in Turtle Island and there in Palestine. And Ruby actually sort of goes on this journey of discovery, of researching the Crown Land and the history of settler colonialism in Ontario, which as is probably common in a certain subsection of progressive young Jewish Canadians, Ruby knows much more about the settler colonial history of Palestine than she does about in Ontario.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so, what Ruby discovers is that even though, the history and the context and the peoples differ between, settler colonial projects, the mechanisms of settler colonialism are shockingly similar, whether in Palestine or here in Canada. And so this is, the novel definitely sort of takes this sort of world view of these issues, right, of settler colonialism. And Ruby and Itai and her other sort of comrades at the camp, they attempt to make some real change in how this is, in how the settler colonial nature of Camp Burnshore, which is very difficult for Ruby to accept and come to terms with, to try and push back against it and change that situation. In some ways, especially in the second half of the novel, it's a novel about political organizing. Ruby tries to organize against Brett in numerous ways.
Yeah, the book really does have this wonderful balance between just a fun read and really exploring super important political, ethical issues. I recommend it to everyone. It's great, and congratulations. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a good place to stop. I really am really honored to have spoken to you and just scratch the surface on this wonderful body of work you have. And I hope you have the rest of your day is wonderful. What are you spending your summer doing?
Spending it. I'm trying to be outdoors as much as possible. A lot of canoeing and swimming and hiking. Also trying to get a fair amount of writing done.
Mm-hmm.
When I'm not writing, I'm more or less teaching creative writing at Trent University. So the school year starts in a couple of weeks. So I'm both trying to get ready for school and trying to finish the projects I wanted to finish this summer.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you so much, Aaron.
Thanks, David. It was great talking to you.
Well, we've come to the end of our show. We'd like to thank you for listening, and we'd like to thank everyone who made our podcast possible, including United Jewish People's Order Executive Director Serena Sarin, and of course, our guest, Aaron Kreuter. This podcast was recorded at Walt Whitman Studios in Toronto. The theme music was composed by Serena Sarin with help from me. My name's David Wall. Until next time, seid gesund.